A quiet evening quickly transforms into a nightmare when Isabella Martinez, a determined and fearless head of a local FBI division, is unexpectedly stopped by a police officer with no apparent reason. But what happens next takes the situation to an entirely new level. With sarcasm, veiled threats, and a gun raised in the shadows of the night, the flames of injustice and racial discrimination are stoked. What the officer doesn't know, however, is that the woman he's belittling is not only a powerful figure, but also a beacon of truth and fairness. Thank you for joining us today. If you find this story compelling, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future stories. Tomorrow, we'll bring another important and impactful story to light. It was twilight when Isabella Martinez steered her sleek silver sedan down the calm suburban streets, heading home after a tiring day at the office. As the head of the FBI's Miami office, she had been working relentlessly and was looking forward to a quiet dinner and a few hours, unwinding with a novel she'd been meaning to finish. Little did she know, tonight would present her with an unexpected and daunting challenge. Red and blue lights flashed behind Isabella, their reflection in the rearview mirror causing her to squint. A siren pierced the calm, signaling for her to pull over. A wry smirk tugged at her lips, not out of humor, but out of sheer disbelief. She had followed every rule. The car was cruising within the speed limit, signaling every turn, and her lane changes were made with precision. Isabella inhaled deeply, easing her car to the side of the road before coming to a full stop. She flicked on her headlights, ensuring everything appeared clear. It was second nature to her, a habit she had adopted as a Latina woman in Miami. Not because she distrusted the law, but because she knew that sometimes, those sworn to uphold it didn't always do so fairly. A tall white officer in a uniform walked up to her window, his steps deliberate and his posture tense. He knocked sharply on the glass, his gaze scrutinizing. Isabella rolled down her window, her expression composed, professional. "Good evening, officer. How can I assist you?" Her voice was calm, yet commanding. The officer, John Matthews, peered at her with suspicion, lingering for a beat before responding. "Driver's license and registration," he demanded. "Why did you stop me?" Isabella asked, keeping her tone even, her brow slightly furrowed. "Can you tell me what prompted the stop?" Matthews shifted uneasily, shrugging as if the reason was self-evident. "You seem suspicious. I need to check your papers to ensure everything's in order." Isabella's frown deepened, but her gaze remained unwavering. "Suspicious," she repeated, her voice cool. "Can you clarify what you mean by suspicious? I don't believe looking suspicious qualifies as a legal reason for a stop." John Matthews' patience snapped, his face reddening with anger. "Are you really going to argue with me?" he barked, his voice rising. "Don't make this harder than it has to be. Just hand over your papers." Isabella slowly retrieved her license and registration from the glove compartment, but she paused before handing them over. "I know my rights, officer," she said coolly, "and I'm entitled to an explanation. If you can't give me one, this is an abuse of power." Matthew's hand slammed against her car door, causing Isabella to flinch in surprise. "Don't lecture me about the law," he yelled. "I'm the one enforcing it. You're not here to teach me anything." The tension in the air grew thick, suffocating. Other cars zipped by, their headlights briefly illuminating the scene, but not a single driver stopped to witness the exchange. Isabella took a slow, measured breath, reminding herself to remain composed. This wasn't the first time she had been in a tense encounter like this, but tonight felt different. She could see the hostility in Matthew's eyes, hear it in his tone. "Officer," she began again, her voice steady, "I pulled over when you signaled. I'm not resisting, but I will not comply with demands that lack a legitimate reason." Her calm demeanor only seemed to fuel Matthew's anger further. "Who the hell do you think you are?" he spat. "Don't act like you know everything. I told you to hand over the papers, so just do it." Isabella held her ground, still clutching the documents in her hand. Her response was quiet, but unwavering. "I'm a law-abiding citizen, officer, and I believe you know that too." As the exchange dragged on, Officer John Matthews' demeanor shifted into full aggression. He suddenly shone a flashlight directly into Isabella's face. Its beam harsh and blinding, as if he was looking for something to incriminate her. "Are you carrying anything illegal?" he demanded. "Drugs, weapons. People like you are often involved in shady business." Isabella's chest tightened, the implication clear. She knew this wasn't a random set of questions, but she kept her composure, her voice steady despite the rising tension. "No, officer," she responded, her words firm. "And I don't think you have any reason to doubt that. I suggest you refrain from insulting me." Matthews growled, his voice dripping with disdain. "I don't need any reason to doubt you," he sneered. "And I don't owe any respect to people like you. I just need to do my job. And if you don't cooperate, I'll be forced to take drastic measures." The threat hung heavy in the air. Isabella could feel the situation slipping out of control, but she refused to let fear take hold of her. "Officer," she said, her voice unwavering, "I am perfectly willing to cooperate as long as you follow the law, but I will not be coerced into doing something that infringes on my rights." As the confrontation intensified, Isabella knew this was just the beginning of something far more challenging than a simple traffic stop. What was happening was no ordinary incident. It was a test, not just for her, but for the very justice system she had sworn to protect. She sat still, her gaze locked on the officer standing outside her vehicle. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, her fingers tingling with tension. Over the years, she had handled countless difficult situations, but she had never imagined that she would become the direct target of such abuse and racial bias. John Matthews, now visibly losing his patience, stood in front of Isabella's car, arms crossed tightly over his chest, his eyes filled with open hostility. "Who do you think you are, challenging me?" he shouted, his voice full of menace. "This isn't a negotiation. You either cooperate, or I'll be forced to take drastic measures." Isabella's voice remained calm and measured. "Officer, I'm not resisting. I'm simply asking you to follow proper procedure. If you can't provide a valid reason for stopping me, I have every right to refuse further cooperation." Her composed response only seemed to fuel Matthew's anger. He raised his hand, pointing a finger at her face as if trying to provoke her. "Enough," he yelled. "Get out of the car, now." Isabella stared at him for a long moment, reading the danger in his every word, in every movement, but she remained firm, unmoving. "I'm not getting out of the car without a valid reason," she replied. "I don't feel safe leaving this vehicle." Matthews took a step forward, slamming his hand against the car door, his voice now bordering on a shout. "Get out of the car. That's an order." Isabella took a slow, deliberate breath, her mind racing. She knew obeying his unreasonable demands could escalate things quickly. Over her years of training and experience, she had learned the most important lesson. Stay calm, no matter what. "Officer," she said with quiet resolve, "I will not obey an unlawful order." Matthews took a step back, his hand resting on his gun, his posture menacing. "People like you don't get to decide anything here," he sneered. "I'm the one in charge. Do you really want to see what happens if you disobey me?" Isabella's heart tightened as she saw his hand inch closer to the gun. This was the moment she had to tread carefully. One wrong move, one wrong word, could trigger something she couldn't control. She remained calm, her voice steady as she spoke. "Officer, I am recording this entire incident," she said, calmly pointing to the phone mounted on her dashboard. "Every move you're making is being documented. If this situation escalates, I'll use it as evidence." John Matthews smirked, the derision in his expression clear. "Do you really think I'm scared of cameras?" He scoffed. "What can someone like you do? Don't forget, I'm the one in control here." As if to prove his dominance, Matthews reached for his gun and drew it from his holster, aiming it directly at Isabella through the car window. "Now, get out of the car. Now," he shouted, his voice thick with authority. The tension in the air felt suffocating, almost unbearable. Isabella remained perfectly still, every muscle in her body tensed but unmoving. She knew that any sudden action could be seen as a threat. Keeping her hands on the steering wheel, she never once took her eyes off the officer. "You're breaking the law, officer," she said, her voice shockingly calm given the gravity of the situation. "I demand you drop your weapon immediately. This is an abuse of power." Matthews sneered, the gun still pointed squarely at her. "Don't try to be clever, girl," he spat. "I told you, this isn't up for discussion. If you don't listen, I will be forced to use force." Isabella understood all too well that the situation was now entirely out of control. This wasn't just an overreach of authority, it was a direct manifestation of prejudice and hatred. But she wasn't about to back down. She decided it was time to play her final card. Slowly, carefully, she moved her hand toward the cell phone mounted on her dashboard, making sure Matthews saw every deliberate motion. "I'm calling your superior," she said calmly, "the sheriff." I'm going to report this entire incident. For a moment, Matthews looked momentarily confused, but his gun didn't waver. You're not allowed to call anyone without my permission, he barked. Isabella didn't even acknowledge his command. She dialed a number and held the phone to her ear, her voice steady as she spoke into it. Hello, this is Isabella Martinez, head of the FBI division. I was pulled over and treated unprofessionally by Officer John Matthews for no reason. He pointed a gun at me without legal justification. I need the sheriff to come immediately to resolve this matter. She hung up the phone, then placed it back in its mount. Her eyes never left Matthews, her expression unwavering as she prepared herself for whatever would come next. John Matthews seemed oblivious to the content of Isabella's call, continuing to speak as if nothing had changed. What are you doing? Do you think you can get away with this without listening to me? He demanded, his voice rising in frustration. Isabella's response was measured, her tone unwavering. I'm not trying to get away with anything. I'm simply asking for fairness and transparency. If you refuse to comply with the law, you will face the consequences. Matthew's grip on his gun tightened, the two locked in a tense standoff, one fueled by hatred and the abuse of power, the other by patience and unshakable courage. In the oppressive silence that followed, a siren pierced the air, drawing closer. Another police car appeared, and out stepped Sheriff Grant. Matthews visibly stiffened, his eyes shifting from aggression to apprehension. The sheriff approached quickly, his demeanor no-nonsense and stern. Matthews, what the hell is going on here? Put that gun down. Isabella remained silent, waiting for Matthews to react. This was the moment when everything would finally be revealed. Matthews turned to face his superior, his expression confused. He lowered his gun, but the tension remained. He tried to regain control of the situation, his voice shaky. Sir, she's not cooperating. I asked her to get out of the car several times, but she refused and even filmed everything to threaten me. Sheriff Grant's frown deepened, his voice laced with disbelief. You think that's a good enough reason to pull out your gun? This is a serious abuse of power, Matthews. Do you even realize what you've done? Isabella slowly rolled down her window, her gaze never leaving the sheriff. Sir, I asked him for a valid reason for stopping me, but he refused to answer. Instead, he threatened me, demanded that I get out of the car, and eventually pointed a gun at me. Sheriff Grant's eyes widened as he took in the situation, recognition dawning in his expression. He looked at Isabella, a mix of surprise and respect in his eyes. You're Isabella Martinez, the head of the FBI division, he asked, his voice softer now. Isabella nodded slowly, her posture calm but resolute. Yes, sir. I was on my way home when I was stopped without cause. I tried to cooperate, but Officer Matthews' actions were completely unacceptable. He also repeatedly insulted me. Sheriff Grant froze for a moment, his eyes flicking from Isabella to Matthews, who was visibly pale. Don't you recognize her? This is the head of the FBI, he said slowly, his voice filled with disbelief. You just made a monumental mistake. Matthews stammered, struggling to come up with an excuse. I didn't know, sir. She didn't present the proper paperwork. I was just following protocol. Grant exhaled sharply, his voice turning icy. Protocol. What protocol allows you to pull a gun on someone who isn't a threat? What protocol allows you to insult and threaten a citizen, especially when she's the director of the FBI? Are you completely stupid? Isabella spoke up then, her tone sharp yet professional, cutting through the tension. Sir, I recorded the entire incident. Every move, every word from Officer Matthews is on that video. I'm not just asking for an explanation. I'm demanding a full investigation into his conduct. Sheriff Grant took a deep breath, his anger simmering beneath the surface. He knew this was no simple mistake. It could very well become a high-profile case that would draw media attention. He turned toward Matthews, his expression cold. Give me your gun, Grant ordered firmly. With no other option, Matthews handed over his weapon. Grant examined it briefly before slipping it into his pocket. He turned back to Isabella. Miss Martinez, he said, his voice softer but still commanding. Would you please step out of the car? I assure you, I'll take it from here. Isabella nodded, opened the car door, and stepped out. Standing tall, her eyes locked onto Matthews, she said firmly, I want nothing more than justice and transparency. You broke the law today, and I will make sure you're held accountable. Grant quickly called in additional officers, who arrived shortly after. He handed Matthews over to two of his subordinates, his expression grim. "Matthews, you're officially suspended from duty. We'll be conducting a full investigation into your actions." Matthews stiffened but did not resist. He mumbled a few incoherent sentences under his breath, his eyes a mix of anger and fear. Isabella observed the scene, a deep sadness settling over her. This wasn't the first time she had witnessed the abuse of power by someone in uniform, but to be a direct victim of it made her realize just how much work remained to change the system. Before leaving, Isabella turned to Sheriff Grant, her expression serious. "I hope you take this seriously, not just because I'm the head of the FBI, but because this could happen to anyone. No one deserves to be treated like this." Grant nodded solemnly, his eyes filled with remorse. "I understand, Miss Martinez. You have my word that this will not be ignored or swept under the rug." As Isabella walked away from the scene, a wave of exhaustion swept over her, but her heart was at ease. She knew she had done the right thing not just to protect herself, but to stand up for those who lacked the power to defend themselves against injustice. Behind her, Matthews was handcuffed and led away by other officers, their gazes heavy with unspoken thoughts. This wasn't just a lesson for Matthews, it was a stark reminder to the entire force that with power came responsibility, and the abuse of power would never be tolerated. The situation was under control, but the repercussions of that night would resonate for a long time. The next morning, Sheriff Grant immediately ordered an internal investigation. Matthews was detained and questioned extensively about his actions. At the same time, the Police Oversight Board and other relevant agencies began their own reviews. Isabella did not stop at simply submitting the video. She provided additional evidence of Matthews' abusive behavior, his demeaning words, and his actions that night. At a press conference, Isabella stood before dozens of reporters, her voice resolute as she addressed the nation. "This is not just a story about me, a head of the FBI who was treated unfairly. This is a story about thousands of Americans, particularly people of color, who have endured discrimination for generations. I am committed to using every resource at my disposal to ensure that justice is served, and not just for me, but for everyone." 2 months after the incident, John Matthews stood in court. The room was packed with journalists, social activists, and ordinary citizens who had come to witness the high-profile case. Matthews' lawyer attempted to defend his actions as a rash reaction in a stressful situation, but the video evidence was undeniable. It clearly showed that Matthews was not threatened. Instead, he used his authority to oppress and intimidate an innocent citizen. Isabella was called to the witness stand. She stood tall and composed, her gaze unwavering as she recounted the entire incident, from being stopped without cause to having a gun aimed at her. Isabella stood tall, her voice steady but filled with conviction as she addressed the court. "Not only did he abuse his power," she declared, "but he also shattered the public's trust in the justice system. If we allow this kind of behavior to go unchecked, the very system meant to protect us will become a weapon of oppression." After days of tense deliberation, the jury delivered its verdict. John Matthews was found guilty of abuse of power, racial discrimination, endangering another person's life, and violating the core principles of law enforcement. His sentence: 4 years in prison. As the gavel fell, Matthews lowered his head in silence, offering no words. The courtroom erupted in applause. For many, this wasn't just a victory for justice, it was a monumental step in the ongoing fight against racism. The case of John Matthews echoed far beyond the walls of the courtroom, serving as a wake-up call not only to local police forces but to law enforcement agencies across the country. Anti-racism seminars and professional ethics training became an essential part of police departments' curriculum, sparking nationwide change. As the FBI director, Isabella saw an opportunity to push for greater reform. She met with lawmakers, community leaders, and activists, proposing new policies to ensure that no officer could ever again misuse their power without consequences. In a press conference, she made her stance clear. "This isn't about revenge," Isabella stated firmly. "This is about reminding everyone that with power comes responsibility. We cannot build a just society if those entrusted with our protection are the ones who harm us." She paused, allowing her words to sink in, before continuing. "Thank you for taking the time to listen to this important story. If you believe in justice and change, please like and subscribe to the channel. Don't miss the next story that matters, because tomorrow will bring you another story worth sharing."